Hi everyone, it's Mr. Barden here. This video lesson is going to be hopefully pretty quick and all about utilizing MIDI and MIDI controllers with Studio One and talking just a little bit about some of the built-in synthesizers that we'll be using in the class. So, what is MIDI? MIDI, you may have heard this before, or just the phrase, but you may not be exactly clear on it. A lot of people actually get this wrong. They think that MIDI is, a virtual instrument sound, things like that. That's not what it is. MIDI is just a set of instructions that are used to tell a synthesizer to play something. Back in the mid 1980s, I think right around 83 to 86, somewhere right in there. It was used to control big hardware synthesizers, and they used these kind of 5-pin connectors right here in order to do that. And basically, what you could do is you would have your controller that would go, and a lot of times they would look like a computer, like a not a computer, a musical keyboard, and you could play notes and send information to a then hardware synthesizer and have that recreate those notes with whatever settings you do. So this is again just a protocol for sending instructions to another instrument. That's all MIDI is. It stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. It is just instructions. If you look at the data going through it, it's just a bunch of little signals, nothing fancy. Um, a lot of high-end devices could send the MIDI out again like a keyboard to control a thing. You could have it pass MIDI through so you can control multiple instruments with one keyboard. You could have one synthesizer control another by again sending out various MIDI data. A lot of fancy devices could really do a lot of fun and exciting things with MIDI. Uh, they were also not cheap. One thing I just want to point out is that MIDI 1.0 again came out in the mid 80s and all that, and MIDI 2.0 wasn't released until 2020. So for over 30 years they had this same standard for sending all this MIDI protocol. They've updated it recently because of major advancements in terms of computer and things in that realm. It's a lot more digital, a lot more internet based. I'm not going to go into the details of MIDI 2.0 right now. But that was it. It was a very effective, very useful, and very small protocol. So you could send data, very quickly, relatively quickly, I should say, around, and it was small little pieces of information. So when USB came out, we were able to, albeit gradually, transition from these 5-pin physical connectors to transmitting the same digital data over USB, which allowed us to create MIDI controllers for the computer and DAWs, which is what we're going into here. And this is again what I'm saying here. Before I get into the computer controllers, I just want to stress this one more time. So the key element of MIDI and MIDI controllers is that MIDI is just the protocol. It is just instructions for an instrument or a computer to follow. That is all it is. So most MIDI controllers will actually not make any sound at all. I've got, I think, 3 plugged in at my desk right now, with this being the closest one. There's no speaker, no sound output, no anything on these devices. You need to connect it to a computer or to a hardware synthesizer or some other instrument, and turn that on and use that to generate the sound. That being said, you can still find some that include a sound synthesis element to it. They vary. I personally own one, and I've seen one other that isn't just cheap garbage that you really wouldn't want to waste your money on, but also isn't several $100s. Again, these can get very expensive when you start adding some stuff like that, and I mean they aren't always cheap anyways, but just know that in most cases it will not make sound. So if you buy this thinking that that's all you need to play and make noises, you're going to be horribly mistaken. You'll also need something to generate the sound. Okay, there we are. So the USB controllers. Again, this is very small amounts of information. They'll send in, play this note, stop playing this note, adjust this data so far. It's very small bits of information. So we were able to pretty easily put it over to control via USB. So we can control DAWs and computers and the whatnot with these controllers. It's very useful with that in the current, state of music production where it's pretty much all done on computers. Um, because of this, too, we don't necessarily need to design these controllers for musical contexts anymore because again they can be used to control any kind of thing, like anything related in the computer, as long as the computer is, and that program is receiving MIDI data. Um, so I'm going to show you some more on the next slide, but we can design these to be whatever we want. Maybe it's buttons, maybe it's sliders, maybe it's pads, maybe it's combinations of stuff, maybe it's something completely different. Who knows? It can be, there's just a large, potentially infinite array of options to choose from with modern USB MIDI devices. Again, the ones I've listed here on the slide are probably the most common, and you'll find different combinations, things like that. Most controllers will actually have different types of things on it. So this one down here at the bottom of my screen, I'm cutting it off a little bit. Let me hide my face. Let me hide my face. Come on, there we go. Is a like a drum pad, so it's not like a keyboard with that mechanism, but it's arranged like a keyboard, so you can play it, uh, but it still feels more like a pad and a controller, like so. And then this lets you do drums or keyboards pretty easily. I've got the one I held up earlier is like that. Um, there's some that also have controls, so that can control your DAW and tell it to stop, play, record, and do a bunch of instructions that way. So that's very useful. This lets your MIDI controllers be extremely specified to doing certain things very well, but also extremely versatile. You can, especially if you're decent at programming some stuff. We won't get into that today, but you can set up very easily some software patches that can receive MIDI data from any kind of MIDI device and use that to control whatever you want. So you can really have limitless possibilities. But just to illustrate some of this, here are some MIDI controllers, and I'm going to hide my face again because I'm over one. And this is just to kind of show the wide variety of options. So here I've got another one that has these kind of arcade buttons with LEDs. So you have some interface to it, but it's just a grid of buttons, and the computer kind of just interprets the signals. Um, there's a large variety of keyboards of varying sizes. Um, Probably the most common are these with about 2 octaves worth of keys, but they do come bigger. I personally have this one down here that has a full 88 sized keys, which is fun. Here's that drum pad keyboard combo I held up earlier. And we actually have a smaller version of this one in my classroom that is a mixer. I have the big one personally, but it's a mixer, so it can control all of the volumes and a whole bunch of other stuff in Studio One. Um, so there's those. You can find, again, different combinations of stuff. Some of them, like this one down here, are modular, so you can change what's attached to it. Several of these have knobs and sliders and buttons for different things, and sometimes you can program them, sometimes you can set them for custom bits. Here's one that I think this is a touch screen in the middle, but you can control a bunch of stuff with knobs around it. um, this one's, again, a drum pad, so you can hit the different things and send MIDI notes to trigger drum sounds. This one over here is another kind of button one, but if you notice, it's completely homemade. So again, you can, if you know what you're doing, you can make these at home very, very easily. So that's just, again, showing a wide variety of stuff. You could probably find a MIDI controller for just about anything you want to do. And I have a lot of them that I've accumulated over the years. In my personal home setup, I usually have, like I said, three, and there are these three kind of right here in the middle. So I have a keyboard that lives over here. You really can't see it very well. If I move that paper, you might see some of the notes, the keys way at the high end. But that's I use that a lot for entering notes and things. I have the um, this one right here that again is used for notes, but more so for percussion stuff. And I use the knobs a lot for controlling Studio One. And then I have my mixer here that I use it for mixing and automating and controls like that. So again, you really can set up and customize your workflow with your MIDI devices and really get it to be something that works. That being said, I kind of have maybe a little bit of overkill for most people. I am a big fan, and I actually have one of these Elise's VI, in this case 25. They also have a 40 key and a 60 key one, I think. But these have, well, pads and knobs and buttons and keys. It has all the stuff in one, and that is a very useful tool to have. Just you have one device and you can take it with you. It does a lot of things. It's very useful. I'm a big fan of these, especially if you're on a budget or you're going to be traveling around. Okay, so that's just a general overview of what MIDI is, instructions that we can send or receive with different devices. But let's actually talk about how we can use it in Studio One. Now, I've got some screenshots here. I'm going to break it down. I'm not going to actually open up Studio One for this because Studio One and OBS don't really like each other. It's better now with some updates and some tweaking I've done, but it's still a little iffy. So to use Studio One and your MIDI controller, it's very easy, very user friendly. The MIDI itself has been standardized. It's a standard protocol, so pretty much any MIDI device will work. We just have to have Studio One recognize it. And again, I'm saying pretty much because things change or stop working or they make new things and so on and so forth. But the first step, which is in my opinion obvious, but I've had to correct this before, is to plug in your MIDI device to your computer. Some devices may require an additional power supply, and they'll come with that if you buy it. But you plug in all the bits. And then you'll open up, again, I use Studio One for my classes, so that's what I'm focusing on. If you're not using Studio One, your program will be different. But open up Studio One, and in the start menu, you'll see in the middle section this configure external devices. So you'll click on that and click add, and that pulls up this window right down here. So Studio One has a bunch of synthesizers already programmed into it. So it'll know how to receive various data and some more specific, it knows how many knobs and things, and it maps them to certain parts of the computer already. So I recommend searching through here to make sure that your device is or isn't in here. If it's not, you can just click new keyboard and give it the manufacturer name and the device name, so that way Studio One can put it in the right spot, and you'll know how to find it because this will be the name you refer to it by. Um, and then you just have to say to receive from that device. So if you click on that drop down menu, it'll show you all the MIDI devices currently connected to your computer, and you'll be able to select that. So once you've done that, generally speaking, at least for my classes, you can ignore the rest. But if you're, well, not in a class I teach or doing other things, you can adjust certain settings and things like that here. I'm not going to get into it right now, but once you've done that, you hit OK until you're back at the start page, and Studio One will recognize your software. So once that's in, again, if it's a keyboard or one that's kind of pre-recognized, a lot of stuff will already be mapped, especially if you're using a presonus MIDI controller with Studio One. Those are already programmed to do certain things. But in order to to utilize it, it's very simple. With your controller, you can map anything to anything in Studio One. It's very simple. You just have to adjust the knob or button or whatever you want to control. So it could be a knob. That's pretty common on MIDI controllers. And then adjust the parameter you want to do. So I would turn my knob physically, and then I would click and drag or adjust whatever slider thing on Studio One I want. And then way at the top corner, there's this interface here. You can see here's the knob that you turned or whatever and what you controlled right here. And if you click this little arrow, it will map those things together. So anytime you turn, in this case, knob 1, that would adjust my main volume in the DAW. And I've got a little video here that shows that. So it's kind of hard to see, but as I'm just kind of illustrating that, and then I'm not doing anything. And as I turn the knob, you see that the slider on the screen is moving, and you can tell I'm doing this because my mouse is nowhere close to what's going on. And you can see those values also changing up here in the box. If you don't like what you bound something to, or you have a limited amount and need to change what knob controls what, to unbind it, you'll see that this triangle has turned blue once it's bound. You just click it again to undo it, and then it's no longer bound to that control. It's, again, very user-friendly, very straightforward. You just say, okay, what do I want to do? What do I want to do? Talk to each other. Okay, so once you've done that, we can use MIDI in the projects to generate musical content. That's their original intended purpose. To do that, there's a lot of text on this slide, but don't worry, it's not gross. We first have to have a synthesizer. If you recall earlier, I said and stressed and repeated, a lot that these devices do not generate sound. They generate instructions for other things to make sound. In the context of your DAW, it's usually a software synthesizer. And Studio One has a whole bunch. We'll go through them all in a little bit. But here's the process. You first have to have a synthesizer to control, and you can find those in the file browser that pops up. If you just click on Instruments and look under presonus, you'll see a bunch. Mojito, which is the one I have up here, is a great one to kind of start with if you're unfamiliar with it. It's really good for bass lines. It does one note at a time. It's pretty useful. But all of them have an interface like this with knobs and sliders and things. And again, you can map the control of any of these to your MIDI device through that method I talked about earlier. You can manually set these to get very custom sounds. You can click where it says default to open a drop down menu of a bunch of presets. If you're unsure where you want to go, that's always a good place to start. But once you've got your synthesizer and it'll open up the interface automatically when you drag and drop it into the session. You'll see this little yellow box here with the name of whatever you typed for your MIDI keyboard. If you made a new one or whatever's connected and it's recognizing, it'll pop up here. If not, under the little drop down menu, you can select it. But you need to make sure that that's correct, because that is what the synthesizer is looking at to receive MIDI data. Another important thing is that you have to arm the track. So this is just like recording audio. You have to tell your track that, yes, I want to record something. But it's not audio, it's going to be instructions. So on the track, you'll see this little button with a dot, and you'll click it and it'll turn red. That means that whenever you start recording, this track will start recording data. So that's important. The next two steps aren't necessarily required, but I highly recommend it, especially if you're just not used to recording MIDI stuff. So on the bottom timeline here, the little transport bar, there's a bunch of stuff, recording things, controls, blah, blah, blah. But way over here of my screenshot, there's the metronome. And the metronome, again, it clicks and keeps time. That's very helpful for recording things, but there's a little wrench icon here. If you click that, it'll open up a window and you can tick a box that says pre-count and tell it how long to pre-count for. I recommend about 2 bars, and then every time you hit the record button or also the asterisk key on your number pad, um, instead of starting immediately, it will count down for, well, the length of whatever you tell it. And my recommendation, 2 bars. So you'll see it go like 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and it'll start recording. At that point, you'll hear a click from the metronome, and actually on the record button, a number will pop up and discuss that, and you'll be able to see it. So once it's recording, a red bar will kind of move across the screen to show you, where it's recording at, what you've already recorded, and so on. That's when you start pressing the keys. So again, this is for musical content. You'll probably have a keyboard or a drum interface, but then you'll start pressing the keys, playing the notes, and so on. You'll see this is kind of how they appear on here, and you'll go until you're done and hit the stop button. And it'll record everything you did in time. Um, if you have this little blue button highlighted, you'll be able to hear it back in your speakers too, which is very useful for MIDI. Um, from there, you can actually double click on this box with the MIDI notes, and it'll pull it up, and you can actually really fine tune it. So if you accidentally missed a note, you can adjust what pitch it's on. If it's not long enough or too long, you can shorten or lengthen all the notes. It's very intuitive, very user friendly. You can add notes, take some away, make them louder, make them softer, all sorts of things like that. And I generally recommend recording your notes to get the general idea, because that's a lot faster than manually entering in everything, but then going in and fine tuning it all so it's exactly how you want. I think that for me, that's kind of the best way to get a lot of information recorded quickly. Okay, these are the synthesizers that come with the Studio One 5 professional version. If you're not using the professional version, if you have, what is it, Prime or Artist or Studio, I think is the other three. There's different versions. Each of them have certain things added or removed depending on how high tier it is. For my class, we use the high tier one. We got a special license for it, so these are all the synthesizers included there. Um, so Impact is a drum synthesizer. It will you can load in a bunch of drum sounds. There's a ton of presets for it and pre-saved drum kits, but it's intended for that. You can also load in external sound files, so it's kind of like a sampler. It's not quite the same, but you can do a bunch of editing, and each pad on there can play a sound, and you can load up a ton of pads. Mai Tai is a more advanced synthesizer than Mojito, the one that I mentioned earlier. Um, they're very similar in that regard in terms of sound quality, I find, but the big difference is that Mai Tai can play multiple notes at once, chords, whereas Mojito only plays one note at a time. Mai Tai also has more controls that you can adjust. Um, I've already talked a bit about Mojito. I think it's really good for bass lines and certain melody lines. It depends on the presetting you're using. Presence is my personal favorite, because it can do things kind of like Mojito and Mai Tai if you know what you're doing in terms of manually setting all the settings, but it's intended to model various real world instruments, and you can tell that just by looking at all the presets, and it sounds pretty decent. You can, again, customize it as you go, but it's, again, used to create real instrument sounds when you don't have any. Um, and let's see, sample one is kind of the last one that comes with Studio One 5, and this one is a full sampler instrument, so you can record or load in your own pre-made audio recordings, and then you can edit and tweak them all you want, but it actually binds it to the keyboard, so you could record a sound and make it into a chord or play it at different pitches. It's a lot of fun to play around with. Um, Other than that, um, if you have your own software synthesizers, maybe you have another DAW you can link to, or you've bought some and just downloaded it and installed it. You can load them all up into Studio One, but that's kind of unique to the player base. But they're just you'll see it pop up in that Instruments tab. Um, Again, it's very fun and very easy to play around with it. I highly recommend just kind of exploring each of these synthesizers. One thing that's very useful is because we're just recording the instructions here. If you know what you want your notes to be, you can record the notes, and then you can go in to the synthesizer and maybe you say, oh, I don't like this one. We'll change the preset or do a different instrument and things like that. But the notes will stay the same. It's just the how they sound and what instrument is playing them will be different. It's like creating sheet music and different people playing it on different instruments. It may be the same music, but a clarinet sounds different than a trumpet, and then that sounds different than some 808 drums. That's all different stuff following the same instructions. Okay, we're just about done. So, um, this is more intended for the students I teach of this, but if you want to practice it, go for it. This video is public. But basically, what I recommend to get a little practice with this is to, well, connect a MIDI device. And if you need to go through that little process of adding it into Studio One, do that. But basically, I recommend creating 3 new instrument tracks. You can do this by dragging and dropping your instruments into Studio One, or if you hit the T key, T is in track, on your keyboard, it'll open up the dialog box for that, and be sure to select instrument from the drop down menu. Again, you can't do this with an audio track, an automation track, or a folder track. We haven't talked about those other ones yet, just the instrument tracks. But once you do that, you can make 3 of them, and then drag and drop the synthesizers onto those tracks. But what I recommend trying out is try to make just an 8-bar beat. Give it chords or a melodic line. I'm being intentionally vague so you can be a little more creative in that. But utilize the Impact, the Mojito, and then either the Mai Tai or the Presence synthesizer. So obviously you'd use the Impact to control drums because that's what it's intended for, and Mojito for the bass line. Again, I think you can have a lot of fun with the bass line being in Mojito, and then whichever one you pick for your third synthesizer, utilize that for any chords or melodic structure that you might want to write. Hey, if you want to do more than that, you can. Um, and then go in and just record yourself playing the MIDI notes to build your beat that's 8 bars long. And that's I think once you pull that off, you'll feel comfortable with loading the sounds, adjusting the settings, recording, stopping, doing all of that stuff. And again, if you want to add more, definitely add more. My tips are to start with the drums first because that's easy to record. Okay, here's the bass drum, boom, 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 for 8 bars, and then go and record again. Okay, and here's the snare and the hi hat, or whatever you want to do, and focus on 1 or 2 notes at a time. I don't know if you can see it. I'm mimicking hitting my keyboard to trigger those notes because that's what I do with this keyboard, um, and just have fun with it. That's the more important bit. So that's kind of it for this video. I'm gonna start wrapping it up. If you enjoyed it, learn something, all the blah blah blah, like, comment, subscribe, YouTube stuff. But definitely comment if you have any questions about material. I love seeing those questions and then responding and answering them as best I can. So I'm gonna end it now, and I'll see you the next time that I see you. Bye.